Can you imagine waking up to news that like over 70 people had been killed in just one day?
Yeah.
And many of them were women and children.
Yeah, it's awful.
That was the reality in the Israel-Palestine conflict on November 10th, 2024. We're going to do a deep dive into Al Jazeera's live coverage to unpack this particularly deadly day.
Right.
In a conflict that's already been going on for over a year.
Yeah, over a year now. And it's crucial to understand that this isn't just another day in an ongoing conflict.
Right.
November 10th was a major escalation.
Right.
And it really reveals a lot about where this conflict might be headed.
So let's break down what made this day so devastating. We have to start with Gaza. Al Jazeera reported a truly horrific incident in the Jabalia refugee camp. A pre-dawn Israeli airstrike completely leveled a family home.
Yeah. And this wasn't just any military target. This was a family seeking shelter.
Right.
And the airstrike killed at least 33 people.
Wow.
13 children and 9 women.
Al Jazeera quoted a relative of the victims who described the scene as bodies torn apart. I mean, how do you even process that?
It's just a gut-wrenching reminder of the human cost of this conflict. And remember, northern Gaza had already been under intense Israeli bombardment for a month leading up to this.
Right.
So you have families trapped, desperate for safety.
Right.
And then this happens.
It's hard to even fathom the level of despair.
Yeah, it's just unimaginable.
It's almost unimaginable. And to make matters even worse, we have that stark warning from UNRWA,
Right.
the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees.
Right.
They're saying famine is likely happening in northern Gaza.
Yeah. And think about what that actually means.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about food shortages here. We're talking about widespread starvation, disease, and potentially even death.
Right.
A full-blown famine in Gaza would be a humanitarian catastrophe unlike anything we've seen in recent history.
And this UNRWA warning, it raises so many questions. Like, is this a direct result of the ongoing conflict? Is it a failure of the international community to provide aid? How do you even begin to address a famine in a region that's essentially under siege?
These are exactly the questions we need to be asking.
Right.
And it underscores the urgency of finding a solution to this conflict.
Yeah.
The situation in Gaza is deteriorating rapidly, and the consequences of inaction are unthinkable.
Yeah. It's clear that the situation in Gaza is dire.
Yeah.
But this conflict isn't confined to just one area. Al Jazeera's coverage also takes us to Lebanon, where the violence has tragically spilled over.
Right. Lebanon has become another battleground in this conflict, unfortunately.
Right.
And on November 10th, we saw a deadly example of that. An Israeli air attack on the village of Almet killed 23 people, including 7 children.
And it wasn't an isolated incident either. We're talking about 5 different regions in Lebanon coming under Israeli fire that day.
Right.
This wasn't just a targeted strike.
Exactly. And to understand why Lebanon is now drawn into this conflict, we need to look at Hezbollah.
Okay.
Hezbollah is a Lebanese armed group that's been engaged in fighting with Israel.
Right.
And their involvement adds another layer of complexity to this already volatile situation.
Al Jazeera's reporter in Beirut described the scene in Almat as complete devastation and destruction, with rescue workers still frantically searching for survivors.
Yeah, and what's so concerning about this attack on Almat is that it demonstrates how this conflict is expanding,
Right.
drawing in more actors, and escalating at an alarming rate.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous sign of things to come if a solution isn't found soon.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like a wildfire, isn't it?
Yeah.
The violence spreads and it's hard to contain. And as you might expect, this escalation has triggered some pretty strong reactions around the world.
Yeah, it has. And these reactions show just how deeply this conflict divides people,
Right.
even in countries far removed from the immediate violence.
Al Jazeera covered a few of these international incidents. One that really stood out to me was the decision in France to ban Palestinian flags at a football match against Israel.
Now, you might think it's just a football match. What's the big deal?
Right.
But this ban sparked a huge debate. Should political symbols be allowed at sporting events?
Right.
Is it a matter of free speech? Or is it about maintaining a neutral and safe environment for fans?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Where do you draw the line?
Exactly.
On one hand, you have people saying that sports should be a place where we can set aside our differences and just enjoy the game. But on the other hand, for many people, these symbols represent deeply held beliefs and identities.
Exactly. And in this case, banning the Palestinian flag felt to some like silencing a voice, especially in the context of this escalating conflict.
Right.
It raised questions about whose narrative gets to be heard and who gets to decide what's considered acceptable speech.
Then over in Amsterdam, protests against the conflict led to clashes between Israeli football fans and pro-Palestinian demonstrators. Things escalated so quickly that the city imposed a temporary ban on all protests.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amsterdam is known for its tolerance and freedom of expression.
Right.
So to see them resort to a protest ban is pretty remarkable. It shows you the intensity of the emotions surrounding this conflict.
Yeah.
And how quickly things can spiral out of control, even thousands of miles away from Gaza and Lebanon.
It's easy to get caught up in the politics and the international fallout, but it's
Right.
important to remember the people at the heart of this conflict.
Absolutely.
The families who have lost loved ones, the people living in fear, the children who are growing up amidst this violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes a single story can bring that human cost into sharp focus. Al Jazeera shared a particularly powerful account from their reporter in Deir el-Balah, Gaza. The reporter described the situation in northern Gaza, where people were entering their 5th week without access to basic necessities like food, water, and medicine.
Can you imagine going 5 weeks without food? And we're not just talking about missing a meal or two.
Yeah.
We're talking about sustained deprivation, the kind that leads to starvation and long-term health problems.
And remember that UNRWA warning about famine in northern Gaza. This reporter's account paints a vivid picture of what that warning actually means on the ground.
Right.
It's not just a statistic.
Right.
It's real people struggling to survive. Imagine being a parent, unable to feed your children, not knowing where your next meal will come from.
It's heartbreaking. And the reporter also mentioned that access to medical care and rescue efforts was severely limited.
Right.
So even if people are injured or sick, they might not be able to get the help they desperately need.
This is where the humanitarian crisis becomes a matter of life and death.
Right.
Without access to basic aid, medical care, and safe passage, people are literally trapped in a desperate situation. This reporter's account is a powerful reminder that behind the headlines and political debates, there are real people suffering.
We've covered so much ground today, from those devastating airstrikes to the international protests, and it feels like we're just scratching the surface of this incredibly complex conflict.
We are. And as we try to make sense of it all, it's important to remember that this isn't just a conflict that's happening over there.
Right.
It has ripple effects that touch all of us, whether it's through the political debates we see playing out in our own countries or the moral questions it raises about our role in the world.
And speaking of moral questions, this brings us back to the big question we posed at the beginning of this deep dive.
Yeah.
What does this day, November 10th, tell us about the trajectory of this conflict?
Well, it's pretty clear that the violence is escalating,
Right.
both geographically and in its intensity.
Right.
We've seen it firsthand with the expansion into Lebanon, a rising civilian casualties, that increasingly desperate humanitarian situation in Gaza.
And you have to wonder, where does it stop? If this cycle of violence continues, what will the long-term consequences be? Not just for Israelis and Palestinians,
Right.
but for the entire region.
Exactly. And that brings us to the international community, because right now they seem unable to effectively intervene.
We saw those reactions, like the flag ban in France and the protest ban in Amsterdam.
Right.
They highlight just how deeply divided the world is on this issue.
Yeah.
Finding a path to peace,
Right.
a sustainable solution, it seems more challenging than ever.
It does, but that doesn't mean we should give up hope. It just means we need to be asking the right questions,
Right.
exploring different perspectives, and challenging our own assumptions. And that brings us to a crucial question for you, our listener.
All right, let's get to the heart of it. What do you think, listener? As this conflict continues to escalate with such devastating consequences, what role should the international community play in seeking a peaceful resolution?
There's no easy answer. This is a complex issue with deep historical roots, and there are multiple stakeholders with conflicting interests, but it's a question we all need to grapple with.
So where do we even begin to untangle this knot? Is it about political pressure, economic sanctions, humanitarian aid? What levers can actually make a difference?
It starts with understanding.
Okay.
Understanding the historical context, the different narratives, the root causes of the conflict. It's also essential to recognize the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza right now. People are suffering, and they need immediate aid and a ceasefire. Those are the immediate priorities.
But a ceasefire won't solve the underlying issues, right? So what about those long-term solutions?
Right. A ceasefire is just the first step. Then comes the hard work of diplomacy, negotiation, and compromise. It requires all parties to come to the table with a genuine commitment to finding a solution that addresses the concerns of everyone involved, a solution that respects the rights and dignity of both Israelis and Palestinians.
This deep dive has been incredibly informative, but it's also left me feeling pretty heavy. It's hard to hear these stories, to see the images of destruction and suffering and not feel overwhelmed.
I understand. It's a natural response. It's easy to feel helpless in the face of such a complex and seemingly intractable conflict. But that's precisely why it's so important to engage with this issue, to stay informed, and to have these conversations.
So, what's the takeaway for our listeners? What can they do? It feels like such a massive global issue. How can one person possibly make a difference?
The first step is to stay informed. Don't turn away from the difficult news. Seek out credible sources, explore diverse perspectives, and engage in respectful dialogue. Don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions and biases. And remember, even though it feels distant, each of us can play a role in advocating for peace and justice.
Well said. We've only scratched the surface of this incredibly complex issue today, but hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listener, a better understanding of the events of this harrowing day and the wider context of the Israel-Palestine conflict.
And more importantly, we hope it inspires you to continue learning, asking questions, and considering what role you can play in promoting peace and understanding. Because ultimately, that's what we all hope for, isn't it? A future where such tragedies are not a daily headline.
Absolutely. A future where peace and justice prevail for all. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a challenging but essential conversation.
And we hope you'll continue to join us as we delve into more critical issues in the future. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.